David Harper slid the divorce papers across the mahogany table with a smirk so wide it barely fit his face, then leaned back in his chair and said loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "Take the 300,000, Emma. That's more than you're worth." His mistress, Victoria, laughed from the corner. His lawyer straightened his tie. And Emma Kensington, the woman who had given this man 7 years of her life, picked up the silver pen without blinking, without trembling, without saying a single word. She signed, quietly, completely, and smiled. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will absolutely take your breath away. Emma Kensington was not the kind of woman who made entrances. She never had been. Even as a child growing up between the structured halls of Swiss boarding schools and the quiet, book-lined study of her father's Geneva estate, Emma had understood instinctively that the most powerful people in any room were never the loudest ones. Her father, Arthur Kensington, had taught her that lesson before she could properly read a balance sheet. "The wolf," he used to say, settling into his leather armchair with a glass of Bordeaux, "does not announce itself before the hunt, Emma. It simply arrives." She had carried those words with her through Oxford, through her MBA, through the early sharp years of her career in international acquisitions. She had carried them into her marriage, and she was carrying them now on a Tuesday morning in late October as she sat in the back seat of a black car, moving silently through the gray Manhattan streets toward the offices of Hargrove and Associates, the firm her husband had chosen to represent him in their divorce. Not Harrison Sterling and Croft David's own firm. That would have been a conflict of interest. So he had hired Gregory Vance instead. Gregory Vance, who had a reputation for being the most aggressive divorce attorney in the tri-state area. Gregory Vance, who had once made a sitting federal judge cry during a deposition. Gregory Vance, who had sent Emma a preliminary settlement document 4 days ago that her own attorney had described in carefully measured legal language as an insult wrapped in paperwork. Emma had read it twice. Then she had folded it neatly, placed it in the top drawer of her desk in the botanical shop she ran in Brooklyn, the one David had always called her little hobby, and she had called her father. That phone call had lasted 47 minutes. By the end of it, the wolf was already moving. The morning of the mediation had started badly for David Harper, though he would not have admitted that to anyone, least of all himself. He had woken at 6, which was unusual. David was not a 6 o'clock person. He was a 7:15 person, sometimes 7:30 on mornings when he had been at client dinners the night before. But that Tuesday, he had snapped awake at 6 with a strange electric restlessness in his chest that he chose to interpret as excitement rather than anxiety, because David Harper did not do anxiety. Anxiety was for people who had not planned correctly. David had planned everything. He showered, dressed in his charcoal Brioni suit, the one Victoria had helped him choose, the one she said made him look like a man who had already won, and he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment, watching the city wake up below him and feeling genuinely and completely like the king of all of it. 7 years. 7 years of marriage to a woman who was in his private and carefully curated assessment simply not built for the life he was building. Emma was intelligent. He would give her that, he had always given her that. But intelligence without ambition was just a library nobody visited. Emma ran a flower shop. A botanical shop, she always corrected him, which he found endearing in the beginning and merely tedious by year 3. She grew things. She pressed leaves into glass frames. She knew the Latin names of plants that nobody but botanists cared about. She was in the language of the world David inhabited, decorative. And now she was going to be expensive, which annoyed him considerably. $300,000. That was the number his financial advisor and Gregory Vance had arrived at after a careful and creative accounting of the marital assets, an accounting that had placed the majority of the family wealth in corporate structures and investment vehicles that predated the marriage and therefore technically, legally, beautifully sat outside the reach of equitable distribution. Emma would get the $300,000, the contents of their joint checking account, and whatever personal items she wished to remove from the penthouse. She would not get a stake in his partnership. She would not get the vacation property in Montauk. She would not get the investment portfolio. She would not get anything that mattered. Gregory had warned him mildly that Emma might contest the valuation, that she might hire forensic accountants, challenge the asset classifications request, a longer discovery period. David had smiled at that. "Emma won't contest anything," he had said. "Emma doesn't like conflict. It's her greatest weakness." He had said it with total confidence because he believed it completely. In 7 years of marriage, he had never once seen Emma raise her voice. He had never seen her slam a door, throw something, make a scene. Even when he had been, and here his internal monologue became somewhat vague and impressionistic, even when he had been less than perfect as a husband, Emma's response had always been the same. A stillness, a quiet withdrawal, a sadness he had chosen to read as acceptance. He had no framework for understanding that the stillness might have been something else entirely. At 9:45, Emma arrived at the mediation. She was wearing a dark navy dress, simple, well-cut, the kind of garment that communicated nothing and everything simultaneously. Her dark hair was pulled back. She carried a single leather portfolio. She had no lawyer beside her. Her attorney, a woman named Claire Sutton, who specialized in high-asset divorce litigation, was already inside the conference room. Emma walked in alone, nodded briefly to the receptionist, and took her seat at the long oval table as though she were attending a routine quarterly review. David was already there. So was Gregory Vance, silver-haired and sharp-jawed, with the particular expression of professional confidence that expensive attorneys wear, the way other men wear cologne. And there in the far corner chair, the chair that was technically outside the mediation proper, technically present only as a support person for David, which Gregory had argued was his client's right, and Claire Sutton had chosen not to fight, sat Victoria Chase. Victoria was 31, a junior partner at Harrison, Sterling & Croft, who had been David's associate for 3 years before she became something considerably less professional. She was wearing a cream blazer and had the particular look of a woman who believes she is watching her future materialize in real time. Emma glanced at her once, briefly, the way you might glance at a door that is already open. "Emma," David said, and his voice had the warm, careful quality of a man who had rehearsed his tone with his attorney. "I'm glad we're doing this civilly." "Of course," Emma said. Gregory Vance opened his briefcase. "We've prepared a revised summary of the settlement terms, Mrs. Harper, which I believe your counsel has already reviewed. We're prepared to finalize today if—" "I've reviewed it," Emma said. "Excellent. Then if we could just—" "I have a few questions," Emma said. Gregory paused, looked at her with the particular patience of a man who is not actually patient. "Of course." "The Montauk property," Emma said. "It was purchased in 2019. "Correct. From a trust that predates." "From a trust that was restructured in 2018, Emma said. "I have the original documentation. The restructuring occurred 14 months after our wedding date, which places the restructured trust squarely within the marriage." She opened the leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Claire Sutton, who did not look surprised. "That's a question. Not an objection, just a question." There was a brief silence. David's jaw shifted slightly, a micro-movement, the kind of thing you only noticed if you had spent 7 years learning the grammar of a person's face. "We can address the trust documentation in a separate session," Gregory said smoothly. "Of course," Emma said, and said nothing further. The session lasted 3 hours. Emma asked 11 questions. She raised no formal objections. She made no emotional appeals. She did not cry, which had clearly been anticipated. Gregory Vance had a box of tissues placed with theatrical casualness at the edge of the table, and at one point David looked at them, then at Emma, with an expression of faint disappointment. What Emma did in between her quiet questions was sign things. She signed the preliminary disclosure acknowledgement. She signed the asset inventory review. She signed 3 procedural forms that Claire Sutton passed to her. Each time she used the same silver pen she had brought from home. Each time her signature was the same clean, unhurried absolute. David watched her sign and felt something he refused to name settle in his stomach. It was the way she was doing it. Not reluctantly, not resentfully, but with a kind of focused calm that he could not locate on any emotional map he possessed. She looked if he was being brutally honest, like a woman who was not losing anything, which was insane. She was losing everything. "You're very composed today," Victoria murmured to David during the brief recess, leaning close enough that her perfume reached him before her words. "I expected more drama." Emma doesn't do drama, David said, but his voice was slightly off, and Victoria heard it, and she frowned. David? She's fine, he said. She's accepting it. This is just who Emma is. Victoria looked across the room at Emma, who was standing by the window with her portfolio looking down at the street below, with a thoughtful expression, completely still, and for reasons Victoria could not have articulated, she did not feel reassured. What neither David nor Gregory Vance nor Victoria Chase knew, what no one in that conference room knew, except Emma and Claire Sutton, was that the things Emma was signing were not precisely what they appeared to be. They were, to a careful legal eye, exactly what they appeared to be. Every form was legitimate. Every document was exactly what its header declared. Emma had not tampered with anything, had not inserted anything, had not attempted any sleight of hand that could be challenged later. She was far too careful for that. What she had done was different. What she had done was understand with a precision that 7 years of being underestimated had honed to a razor edge exactly which forms mattered. Not today, not in the immediate calculation of who got the Montauk house and who got the $300,000, but in the longer calculation, the one David didn't know was being run. Because while David had been building his legal strategy around the divorce itself, around assets and valuations and trust structures, Emma had been operating on an entirely different level. 6 weeks earlier, sitting in the study of her botanical shop in Brooklyn with her laptop and 3 cups of cold coffee and her father's voice in her ear through her earpiece, Emma had begun to look not at what she was losing, but at what David was standing on. Harrison Sterling and Croft was a prestigious firm, 32 partners, 18 floors in a midtown tower, a client list that read like a Fortune 500 index. It had been for 12 years one of the most respected legal practices on the East Coast. What it had also been for the last 4 years was quietly and comprehensively over-leveraged. Emma had not known this when she started looking. She had started looking simply because she needed leverage, something to make David and Gregory Vance take her seriously enough to negotiate honestly, rather than bully her into a settlement designed to leave her with nothing. She had asked her father's research team to pull the firm's financial records. Publicly available documents, regulatory filings, property records, the kind of information that sits in the open, unremarkable, unexamined, until someone looks at all of it together. What they found had taken her breath away. The firm's midtown tower, all 18 floors of it, sat on a master lease that had been held for 11 years by a commercial real estate subsidiary called Meridian Properties Group. Meridian had been acquired 2 years ago by a Luxembourg-based holding company called Alder Capital. And Alder Capital's primary institutional backer, the entity that held a controlling interest in its parent fund, was a Geneva-based private equity firm called Kensington Global, her father's firm. Arthur Kensington had not known this when Emma called him. He had a portfolio that spanned 14 countries and hundreds of subsidiary holdings. He did not track every asset in Alder's position book personally, but when Emma told him, when she explained what she had found, there had been a silence on the line that she knew from long experience of her father's silences was not surprise, but calculation. "So we hold the lease," he had said. "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Tell me about the debt." And Emma had told him. The firm's revolving credit facility, a $90 million line held across 3 banking relationships, had been quietly shopping for refinancing for 8 months. 2 of the 3 banks had already signaled they would not renew. The third was a regional institution that was itself under regulatory pressure. The firm needed a primary lender, and they needed one before their quarterly review in mid-November, which was, Emma had checked, 4 weeks away. "Who's the debt holder of record for the largest facility?" Arthur had asked. Emma had paused, looked at her notes. "A fund called Castleway Credit Partners." She had heard her father exhale, and then he had laughed a quiet, private laugh that she had heard only a handful of times in her life. The laugh of a man looking at a chessboard and seeing very suddenly that the game is already over. "Castleway," he said, "is in my portfolio, Emma. I acquired them 8 months ago." The line had gone very still. "Papa," she had said softly. "Did you know?" "I did not," he said, "but I do now." Back in the conference room, the mediation was moving toward its conclusion. Gregory Vance was spreading the final settlement documents across the table with the comfortable efficiency of a man processing a foregone conclusion. David was leaning back in his chair with his hands loosely folded, exuding the specific relaxed energy of a person who believes they have already won. The final settlement, Gregory said, represents a fair and comprehensive resolution of all marital claims. Mrs. Harper will receive the sum of $300,000 payable within 30 days of the final divorce decree, along with full title to the personal vehicle registered in her name and the right to remove personal property from the marital residence within 60 days. Mr. Harper retains all corporate assets, investment vehicles, real property, and partnership interests as outlined in the attached Schedule A. Emma picked up the settlement document. She read it, not quickly, carefully, page by page. David watched her read and felt the restlessness from the morning return to his chest. "Emma," he said, and now his voice had less warmth and more edge. "It's a straightforward document." "Most of the important ones are," Emma said without looking up. She reached the signature page, uncapped her pen. "You're sure about this?" Claire Sutton said quietly. Emma looked at her attorney. Claire's expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were doing something different. Something that contained a very carefully suppressed awareness of the fact that what was about to happen was not going to end here. "I'm sure," Emma said. She signed. David exhaled. Gregory Vance made a small, satisfied sound that he disguised as a cough. Victoria from her corner allowed herself a smile. And Emma capped her pen, placed it back in her portfolio, and folded her hands on the table. "There is one additional matter," she said. Gregory looked up. "I'm sorry. I said there is one additional matter." Emma opened her portfolio and removed a single envelope which she placed on the table and did not slide to anyone. She simply left it there in the center, visible to all of them. "It's not part of the mediation. It's a courtesy notice. My attorney advised me that I'm not legally required to provide it." "A courtesy notice of what?" David said. "Of a commercial transaction," Emma said. "One that was finalized this morning." The room was very quiet. "What transaction?" David said, and his voice had changed. The warmth was gone entirely, now replaced by something harder and less rehearsed. Emma looked at him. For the first time all morning, she looked at him directly, fully, without the slight downward angle she had maintained throughout the session. She looked at him the way her father looked at things he had already decided about. "Kensington Global," she said, "has completed its acquisition of Castleway Credit Partners' full position in Harrison Sterling and Crofts' primary revolving credit facility. $90 million callable under the original covenant terms." She paused. "It also holds through Meridian Properties Group and Alder Capital the master lease on your firm's Midtown offices." Another pause. "Kensington Global is my father's company." One more pause. The final one. "I sit on its board." David stared at her. Gregory Vance had gone very still. Victoria in her corner had stopped smiling. That's not possible," David said. You're not on any board. You run a flower shop." "Botanical shop," Emma said pleasantly. "And I have sat on the Kensington Global board since I was 28 years old. It was never a secret. You simply never asked." She stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up her portfolio. "The courtesy notice in that envelope contains the contact information for Kensington Global's legal team. I suggest Harrison Sterling and Croft reach out at their earliest convenience to discuss the facility terms." She looked at Gregory Vance, who was now the color of old plaster. "And I would suggest that the review of the Montauk Trust documentation, the one you said we could address in a separate session, be moved to the top of that conversation." She looked at David one last time. He was sitting in his charcoal Brioni suit in the chair where he had been so certain he had already won, and he was looking at his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, the woman he had handed $300,000 like a tip, and his face was doing something Emma had genuinely never seen it do before in 7 years. It was afraid. "Emma," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded entirely different from how it had sounded that morning. Smaller, uncertain. Like a man calling out in a room he has just realized is much larger than he thought. Emma nodded once, politely, completely. "Take care of yourself, David," she said. And she walked out of the room, down the hallway, into the elevator, and out onto the gray Manhattan street where her black car was waiting, and where for the first time since she had received those divorce papers 4 weeks ago, she let herself close her eyes and breathe. Her phone buzzed, a text from her father. "How did it go?" She typed back 3 words. "The hunt is done." His reply came in under 10 seconds. "I never doubted you." She put the phone in her bag, looked out the window at the city moving past, and felt the particular complete quiet of a woman who has been underestimated for the last time. In the conference room on the 14th floor, David Harper was still sitting in his chair. The envelope was still in the center of the table. Gregory Vance was on his phone, speaking in the low, rapid, carefully controlled tones of a man managing a rapidly deteriorating situation. Victoria had stood up and was standing near the window, her cream blazer very white against the gray. Outside her expression, the expression of a person reassessing everything. "How did she—" David started. "David," Gregory said, covering the phone. "Not now." "She runs a flower shop," David said. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking to the room, to the version of the morning he had constructed, and believed in completely the version that was now coming apart around him like wet paper. "She has never once in 7 years said anything about she never told me she was on the board. She never—" "David." Gregory's voice was sharp now, professional control cracking slightly at the seams. "I need you to be quiet while I make this call." David looked at the envelope. He looked at the signature page of the settlement. He looked at the empty chair across the table where Emma had sat for 3 hours, asking 11 quiet questions, signing everything she was given, waiting. And in the particular terrible silence of a man who has just understood what has happened to him, David Harper sat very still and said nothing at all. The wolf, after all, had already gone. The black car had barely turned the corner off Lexington Avenue when Gregory Vance's office phone began to ring. Not his cell, his office line. The direct number that only 3 categories of people possessed senior partners at firms he had long-standing relationships with opposing counsel on active cases, and the kind of clients whose retainers had 6 zeros attached to them. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. The mediation had ended 14 minutes ago. He let it ring twice before picking up. "Gregory Vance?" The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried, and carried the faint acoustic quality of a call originating overseas. "Mr. Vance, my name is Thomas Adler. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Kensington Global. I'm calling as a professional courtesy because I understand you represented the counterparty in a mediation this morning that involved one of our board members." Gregory sat down, slowly, the way a man sits when his legs have decided to make a unilateral decision. "Yes," he said carefully. "I'm aware of the Kensington connection that was raised in today's session." "Good," Thomas Adler said. "Then you'll understand why I'm also calling on behalf of Castleway Credit Partners, whose full position in your client firm's revolving credit facility was transferred to Kensington Global at 9:15 this morning Eastern Time." A brief pause. "The transfer was recorded and confirmed by the relevant banking authorities approximately 40 minutes before your mediation concluded." Gregory said nothing. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Vance," Adler continued. "Kensington Global has no present intention to accelerate the debt facility. However, our standard covenant review process requires us to conduct a full financial audit of all debtor entities within 30 days of any change in debt ownership. That process will begin on Monday." Another pause, this one slightly longer. "Given the current state of Harrison, Sterling and Croft's banking relationships, which I am sure you're more familiar with than I am, we thought it appropriate to give you advance notice." "I see," Gregory said. His voice was professional. His hand holding the phone was not entirely steady. "One more thing," Adler said. "The Meridian Properties lease for the firm's Midtown offices comes up for its 5-year renewal evaluation in January. We'll be sending the standard evaluation documentation to the firm's managing partner directly. But again, professional courtesy." A final pause. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Vance?" The line went dead. Gregory sat in the silence of his own office for a full 30 seconds. Then he stood up, walked to his door, opened it, and told his assistant to get Harrison Sterling and Croft's managing partner on the phone immediately. His assistant, who had worked for Gregory for 11 years and had never heard precisely that tone in his voice, had the call connected in under 4 minutes. Richard Sterling picked up on the second ring. "Gregory," he said warmly, "I assume this is about the Harper divorce finalizing." David said it went. "Richard," Gregory said, "clear your afternoon. We need to talk." There was a pause. The warmth in Sterling's voice receded slightly. "Is there a problem?" "There's a situation," Gregory said, "and I need you to be sitting down when I explain it, because some of what I'm about to tell you is going to sound like I'm describing something that couldn't possibly have happened." Another pause. Longer this time. "Tell me," Richard Sterling said, and Gregory Vance told him. The silence that followed lasted so long that Gregory checked his phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. It was. "Richard, she's on the Kensington board," Sterling said, and his voice had the hollow quality of a man speaking from the bottom of a very deep hole. "Emma Harper, David's wife. She has been on the Kensington board since she was 28 years old, and David has been a senior partner at my firm for 4 years, and not once did he disclose that his wife held a board position at a private equity group that had an indirect interest in our lease structure." "It appears not," Gregory said. "Where is David now?" "I believe he's still in the building." "Get him to my office," Sterling said. "Now. Tonight. I don't care what he has planned." His voice was still controlled, still the voice of a man who had managed crises for 30 years. But underneath it, running like a current beneath ice, was something Gregory recognized from the worst moments of his own career. It was the sound of a man realizing that the solid ground he was standing on had at some point he could not precisely identify turned into something else entirely. And Gregory, don't let him talk to anyone else first. Not Victoria. Not the other partners. Me first. "I know." "Understood," Gregory said. He hung up and sat for another moment in his quiet office, looking at the far wall where his law degree hung alongside the framed photographs of his most celebrated victories. Then he thought about Emma Kensington sitting across the mediation table for 3 hours, asking 11 quiet questions, signing everything placed in front of her and saying nothing about any of it until the moment she stood up to leave. For the first time in 23 years of aggressive legal practice, Gregory Vance thought about a woman he had underestimated and felt in a place considerably more honest than his professional exterior, something very close to respect. He called David Harper's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He left a message in the measured, neutral tones he had spent decades cultivating. "David, it's Gregory. Call me back within the next 10 minutes. This is not optional." Then he opened his desk drawer, removed a bottle of Tylenol he kept there for complicated days, and took 3. David Harper, at that precise moment, was sitting in his car in the parking structure beneath the Hargrove building engine, running both hands on the wheel, going nowhere. He had not called Victoria. He had not called any of his partners. He had sat in the elevator after the mediation with Gregory on the phone, listening to the words coming through the speaker: debt facility, Kensington Global Castleway Credit Partners board member since age 28, and each phrase had landed somewhere inside him with the specific nauseating impact of information that rewrites the past rather than just the future. She had been on the board for 4 years before they even met. He had known in the abstract that Emma came from money. Everyone who knew Arthur Kensington knew he had money. But Arthur Kensington was a name that existed for David, the way weather in countries he had never visited existed real, presumably significant to those involved, but operating in a different atmosphere from his own. He had met Arthur twice, both times briefly, both times at large gatherings where Arthur had been courteous and remote in equal measure, the way extremely wealthy men are courteous and remote when meeting their daughter's husband, who they have decided in the manner of private equity founders to observe rather than engage. David had interpreted that remoteness as disapproval. He had been partially right. What he had not interpreted correctly, what he had failed catastrophically and completely to investigate, was the structure, the actual financial architecture underneath the name Kensington. He had assumed wealth. He had not thought to ask what kind or how much or how it moved through the world or whether any part of it happened to be touching the foundations of his own career. Emma had known sitting across from him at their first dinner on their 3rd date on the morning of their wedding on every ordinary Tuesday of their marriage exactly how close the structures were. She had never said a word. He had assumed that was because it was irrelevant. He understood now, sitting in the parking structure with the engine running and Gregory Vance's voicemail still unlistened to on his phone, that she had been silent because she was intelligent. Because she understood that information held quietly compounds over time like interest. Because she had been in the most fundamental sense playing a longer game than he had even known was being played. His phone rang again. Gregory. He answered it this time. "Richard Sterling wants you in his office tonight," Gregory said without preamble. 7 o'clock. "I was going to—" "David." Gregory's voice was not warm. It was the voice of a man who was no longer being paid to be on David's side. I am telling you, as someone who has spent 23 years handling situations like this, you need to be in that office at 7 o'clock. You need to be prepared to have a conversation that is going to be deeply uncomfortable. And before you go, you need to think very carefully about everything. You know everything about your wife's family business, because Richard Sterling is going to ask you questions about it, and the only answer that will make your situation worse than it already is the one where you tell him you didn't know. A pause. I didn't know, David said. The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. Then God help you, Gregory Vance said quietly and disconnected. Victoria Chase found out approximately 40 minutes later the way most people in law firms find out about things that are not yet officially known through the particular atmospheric change that moves through an office when something serious has happened. The slightly longer pauses in conversation. The associates suddenly very busy with things that involve keeping their heads down. The managing partner's assistant rescheduling 3 evening appointments with a tone that communicated nothing and everything. She was in her office reviewing a client file when her closest ally at the firm, a second-year partner named Marcus Webb, who was constitutionally incapable of sitting on information, appeared in her doorway and closed it behind him. "You need to know something," Marcus said. Victoria looked up from her file. Marcus's expression was not his usual expression. His usual expression was the smooth, calculated pleasantness of a person who has chosen likability as a professional strategy. This expression was different. This expression was the one underneath the strategy. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, the office was very quiet. "Kensington Global," she said. "That's her father's company." "Yes, and they hold our debt and our lease." "The debt as of this morning. The lease has apparently been sitting there for over a year without anyone connecting the ownership chain." Victoria put down her pen. She looked at the middle distance for a moment, doing arithmetic that was not numerical. "David knew," she said. "Victoria, he had to know," she said, and now her voice had an edge in it that she was not entirely controlling. "You don't marry someone for 7 years and not know what their family does. You don't. He told me she ran a flower shop. He told me she was basically—" She stopped herself, looked at Marcus. Did he tell Richard he didn't know? That's what Gregory Vance is apparently claiming on his behalf. Victoria stood up, walked to her window, stood there with her arms crossed, looking at the city, doing a different kind of arithmetic now. The kind that involves personal exposure. The kind that involves what information you have shared with someone who has just revealed himself to be a liability. She had shared quite a lot as it happened. Over the past 18 months, in the comfortable intimacy of being David Harper's closest confidant at the firm, she had told him things. About the partnership structure, about which clients were unhappy, about the refinancing difficulties. She had been the one to first hear about that from a conversation she should not have been party to, and had shared with David over dinner because she trusted him and because she believed their futures were aligned. She understood now that they were not. "I need to talk to a lawyer," she said. "You are a lawyer," Marcus said. "I need to talk to a lawyer who is not currently employed by a firm that might be in receivership by next Thursday," she said. Her voice was very steady. This was one of Victoria's gifts, her ability to be completely steady in moments of genuine crisis, which was also why she had risen as quickly as she had, and why the steadiness now was not calm but calculation. "And I need to know exactly what David said to Richard tonight before I say anything to anyone." Marcus nodded and left because he recognized the particular quality of Victoria's tone that meant the conversation was over. Victoria stood at her window for another full minute. Then she sat back down at her desk, opened a new document on her computer, and began typing a memo that she addressed to no one and dated 2 days in the future. The memo contained, in careful and precise legal language, a representation of everything David Harper had disclosed to her regarding the firm's financial situation, not because she planned to use it, because she was a lawyer and lawyers who survived understood that documentation was armor, and she intended to survive this. Meanwhile, in his study on the Upper East Side, the brownstone study lined with first editions and financial documents that his daughter knew the precise coordinates of better than he remembered. Arthur Kensington was on his second call of the afternoon with Thomas Adler. "The notice was received," Adler said. "Gregory Vance's office confirmed receipt at 3:17. And Sterling." The managing partner's assistant confirmed the internal meeting is scheduled for tonight, 7 o'clock. Arthur made a sound that was not quite satisfaction. He was sitting in the same leather chair he had sat in when Emma called him 6 weeks ago, and he was holding a glass of water, rather than Bordeaux, because he had not yet decided whether this was a celebrating moment or a working moment. He suspected it was still a working one. "The audit team," he said. "Monday." "Ready," Adler said. "Full team. We've already requested the preliminary documentation under the debt covenant provision. Technically, they have 5 business days to comply, but they'll comply within 2, Arthur said. Richard Sterling is not a man who ignores timelines when money is involved. He paused. "How's Emma?" There was a brief, professionally respectful silence on Adler's end of the kind that exists when a chief legal officer is being asked about his employer's daughter by his employer. "I spoke with Claire Sutton this afternoon. She said Emma was composed." "She was always composed," Arthur said. He set down his glass. "How did Vance react when you called him?" "He listened very carefully and said very little." Adler said, "He's good." "He is," Arthur agreed. "But good is not the same as prepared. There's a difference between being good at the game you expect to play and being good at a game you didn't know was on the table." He picked up his glass again. "Make sure the Monday team has full documentation of the lease chain. I don't want anyone at that firm claiming they didn't understand the ownership structure." "Already prepared," Adler said. "Good," Arthur said. "Then we wait." He set the phone down and looked across the room at the window where the late afternoon light was doing its particular early winter thing of becoming gold and then gray very quickly. He thought about his daughter at 23 arriving at Oxford with a suitcase and a mind like a precision instrument. He thought about her at 28, taking her board seat with the particular matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has always known this was where they belonged. He thought about her at 32, sitting in a Brooklyn botanical shop with cold coffee and a laptop finding the fault line in a structure that had taken him 40 years to build and calling him not because she was afraid, but because she needed a partner. He had told her once, when she was perhaps 12 years old, that the greatest advantage any person could have in any negotiation was to be comprehensively underestimated by the other side. She had remembered. In the botanical shop in Brooklyn, which Emma had reached by subway because she had always preferred the subway to the car for thinking she was watering her Monstera Deliciosa, when her phone rang. Not her personal phone. The second phone. The one with the Kensington Global number. It was Claire Sutton. "The Montauk Trust documentation request has been formally escalated," Claire said. "Gregory Vance filed a motion to extend discovery 40 minutes ago." "On what grounds?" Emma said, moving to the next plant. "Newly identified complexity in the asset valuation," Claire said, and Emma could hear the professional containment of amusement in her attorney's voice. "He's trying to reopen the settlement discussion." "He can file whatever he wants," Emma said. "The settlement is signed. Both parties executed it in front of a certified mediator. The grounds for reopening are limited." "I know that," Claire said, "and he knows that. I think the motion is less about succeeding and more about buying David time to understand his position before the Monday audit makes it irrelevant." Emma was quiet for a moment, holding the small green watering can her grandmother had given her. Pressed copper, slightly dented on one side, the most valuable thing in the shop, in every sense that mattered to her personally. "Let it run its course," she said. "Don't oppose it aggressively. Let them feel like the motion bought them something." "You want them comfortable?" Claire said. "I want them to stop looking at the divorce," Emma said quietly, "and start looking at the audit, because the audit is where the real conversation happens." She set down the watering can. "And Claire, when Sterling's team calls you, and they will call you because they'll want to know if there's a negotiation to be had, tell them the truth." "Which truth?" "That I'm not interested in the firm's survival," Emma said. "I'm interested in what it becomes afterward." There was a pause on Claire's end. Not uncertainty, comprehension. "I'll be available," Claire said. Emma hung up, stood for a moment in the quiet of her shop, surrounded by green things that grew slowly and surely, and without drama, rooting themselves into whatever they were given, and becoming over time immovable. Her personal phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize immediately and then did. Victoria Chase. The text was 2 sentences. "I think we need to talk, not about David, about what I know and what you might need to know." Emma read it twice. She stood very still, the way her father stood still when something unexpected entered the calculation. Not surprised, not alarmed, present, assessing. deciding what this information meant, and what it changed, and what it confirmed about things she had already suspected. Victoria Chase, it turned out, was not quite as simply positioned as Emma had assumed. She thought for a long moment, looking at the message. Then she typed back, Thursday, 11, the Botanical Shop on Atlantic Avenue, come alone. She put the phone in her pocket and returned to her plants. Outside, the city continued at its usual indifferent pace, full of people moving between things they controlled and things they only believed they controlled, which was most things, which was the fact that every person in every position of apparent power was perpetually failing to account for. The difference was that some people knew this and some people didn't. Emma had always known it. David, sitting in Richard Sterling's office at 7 o'clock that evening, across from a man whose face had been professionally composed for decades and was currently struggling with that project in ways that were visible to everyone in the room, was just beginning to learn it. "Walk me through it," Richard Sterling said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man keeping something very large in a very small space. "From the beginning. When did you know that Emma's family had an interest in this firm's financial structure?" David opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the surface of the desk. "I didn't," he said. Sterling looked at him for a long time without speaking. "David," he said at last, and the way he said the name, not warm, not hostile, but with the specific weariness of a man who has just understood the full size of the problem. "I've known you for 9 years. I made you a partner at this firm 4 years ago because I believed you were someone who understood the difference between what you knew and what you thought you knew." He leaned forward. "Tell me that's still true." David looked up. For the first time that day, he did not look like the man in the charcoal Brioni suit who had won everything. He looked like a man who had driven very fast toward a horizon that turned out to be a wall. "I genuinely did not know," he said, "about the board seat, about the holdings, about any of it." His voice was quiet and stripped of its usual performance, and this paradoxically made it more convincing than anything he had said in the conference room that morning. "She never told me." Sterling held his gaze for another long moment. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think she did." He leaned back, looked at the ceiling briefly, then looked back at David with an expression that contained many things, none of them comfortable, and said what he had been building toward since Gregory Vance's call that afternoon. Which means she had this prepared, before the divorce, before the mediation, before... He stopped himself, rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture David had never seen him make in 9 years. "She waited until the settlement was signed," Sterling said quietly. "She waited until every asset was locked in and there was no legal avenue to renegotiate, and then she told us." He paused. "That's not a coincidence, David. That's a strategy." The word landed in the office the way that particular word always lands when spoken by someone who has just realized they were on the wrong side of one. David said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because Richard Sterling was correct, because Emma Kensington had spent months building something that David, for all his intelligence and preparation and certainty, had walked straight into without seeing a single part of it until she chose to let him see it. And she had chosen the exact moment she needed, not a second earlier, not a second later, with a precision that, in some deeply inconvenient part of him that existed below his pride and his fear and his current very serious professional crisis, he recognized as extraordinary. He had called her decorative. He sat in the chair across from Richard Sterling and understood completely and too late what a catastrophic error of perception that had been. Richard Sterling did not sleep that night. His wife noticed at 2 a.m. when she found him in the kitchen, still in his dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, reading something on his laptop with the particular focused stillness of a man who has stopped hoping for good news and is now simply trying to understand the full dimensions of bad news. She asked if he was all right. He told her it was a firm matter. She had been married to him for 31 years and knew that particular phrase meant she should make tea and ask nothing further. She made tea, he did not drink it. What he was reading for the 3rd time was the full ownership chain of Meridian Properties Group, which had taken his assistant 4 hours to compile, and which confirmed with the calm indifference of corporate documents exactly what Gregory Vance had described on the phone. Meridian to Alder Capital to Kensington Global. Kensington Global to Arthur Kensington to Emma Kensington, Harper board member, who had sat across a mediation table from his senior partner's attorney that afternoon and said nothing about any of it until she stood up to leave. The lease had been in the Kensington orbit for 14 months. 14 months during which Emma had been a married woman in this building's orbit, attending firm events, smiling at partners' dinners, discussing presumably the weather and the appetizers, while the ground under all of them quietly changed ownership. Sterling closed the laptop, looked at the kitchen wall. He had built this firm over 27 years. Not alone Harrison had been there in the early years, and Croft had brought the capital that made the first expansion possible. But Sterling was the architecture of the thing, the person whose judgment had shaped which clients they took, and which partners they promoted, and which risks they absorbed. He had made 43 partnership decisions in 27 years. 40 of them he stood behind completely. 2 he had mixed feelings about. 1 he had with the clarity that comes only from sitting in a kitchen at 2 a.m, reading corporate documents gotten catastrophically completely wrong. David Harper had been good. He was good. That was the problem with it. Competent, charming, excellent with clients. The kind of partner who brought in business without being asked and managed relationships without being managed. Sterling had promoted him because the evidence supported the promotion. He had not asked because it had not occurred to him to ask whether the man understood the full scope of what he was bringing with him into the firm. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. He did not call David. He called Harrison, who was 72 and retired in Scottsdale, and deserved to hear about this from Sterling directly rather than from the cascade of phone calls that would follow the Monday audit. The call lasted 6 minutes. Harrison said very little, which was his way, and at the end he said only, "What does she want, Richard?" Sterling paused. "She says she's not interested in the firm's survival. She's interested in what it becomes afterward." Another pause longer from the Scottsdale end. "Then figure out what she wants it to become," Harrison said, "and decide whether that's something you can live with." And he hung up. Sterling sat with that for a while. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep, but he lay in the dark and thought about the sentence, "what it becomes afterward," and what a woman who had been underestimated for 7 years and had prepared this quietly and this precisely for this long might mean by it. He did not have an answer, but the question felt uncomfortably like the most important one he had encountered in years. David, by contrast, slept badly in the guest room of an apartment that was technically still his, but felt overnight like a set for a life that was being struck and hauled away. He had come home from Sterling's office at 9:40 and sat in the kitchen and called Victoria 3 times without an answer. The 3rd time she texted back, "Can't talk tonight, call you tomorrow," which told him several things, none of them reassuring. He had made himself the drink he didn't finish and gone to bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the one question he could not stop returning to, which was not about the firm or the debt or the lease, but about the 7 years themselves, about Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings and the 1,000 small conversations of a marriage, about Emma sitting across from him at dinners listening to him describe deals and cases and victories, nodding, asking the occasional quiet question, and knowing. All of it, the whole structure, the way the ownership chains connected and the debt sat and the lease renewed. She had known all of it and said nothing. He thought about the question Gregory had said Sterling would ask, "Did you know?" He had not known. That was genuinely true. But lying in the dark, he found himself facing a different and more uncomfortable question, which was, why hadn't he asked? In 7 years, he had asked Emma almost nothing about Kensington Global. He had met her father twice and treated him like weather. He had categorized Emma as decorative and left the category unchallenged for 7 years because nothing in his model of the world had required him to challenge it. He had, in the most precise and damning sense, not been curious about his wife. And the reason he had not been curious was the reason for all of it, which was that he had looked at a woman who grew things quietly and spoke softly and ran a shop with soil under her fingernails, and he had decided without investigation that there was nothing there that needed investigating. He fell asleep at 3:15 with that understanding sitting in him like a stone, and when he woke at 6, the stone was still there. The week that followed moved with the speed of a controlled detonation. On Monday morning, the Kensington Global Audit team arrived at Harrison, Sterling, and Croft's Midtown offices at 9 sharp. Not with drama, not with a crowd, but with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times. 6 professionals in dark suits led by a senior analyst named Patricia Cho, who had the kind of precision that made paralegals visibly nervous. They installed themselves in the firm's secondary conference room and began requesting documents. The first request list was 43 items. It arrived via email at 9:12. Sterling's CFO looked at it, looked at the office manager who printed it, and said very quietly, "God." By noon, the associates were talking. By 2, the senior associates were talking. By 4, 2 third-year partners had called headhunters. Not because anything was confirmed, because in a firm, the atmosphere communicates faster than the memos, and the atmosphere that Monday was unmistakable. The ship was taking on water. Richard Sterling moved through all of it with the particular controlled composure of a senior litigator who has spent 30 years not showing juries what he was thinking. He answered questions. He signed document releases. He met with the audit team at 11 and at 3 both times with his CFO beside him, and his expression giving away nothing. Patricia Cho asked her questions with a polite thoroughness that Sterling recognized as the professional signature of someone who already had most of the answers and was now building the documented record. He called Thomas Adler at 4:15. "I'd like to request a direct conversation with Emma," he said. He used her first name deliberately, signaling that he understood the personal dimension and was not pretending otherwise. Adler paused. "I'll pass the request along," he said. "I can't commit to a timeline." "I understand," Sterling said. Tell her I said I'd like to understand her intentions for the firm, not argue them, understand them." Another pause. "I'll tell her exactly that," Adler said. Sterling hung up and looked at his CFO, who had been sitting across the desk during the call with the expression of a man standing at a bus stop in the rain. "How bad is the cash position if they call the debt in 90 days?" Sterling asked. The CFO took a breath. "If the banking relationships don't stabilize before then, and if the 2 clients we're at risk of losing do in fact leave..." He stopped, restarted. "It would be a very serious conversation about the firm's ability to continue in its current form." "That's a lawyer's answer," Sterling said. "Give me the CFO's answer." The CFO looked at him steadily. "We survive if we restructure. We don't survive if we don't." Sterling nodded once. "Then we find out what restructuring looks like in Emma Kensington's vocabulary," he said. Victoria Chase received Emma's text on Monday evening when she was sitting in her own apartment for the 3rd night in a row, eating takeout and working through every document she had quietly removed from the firm's shared drive onto her personal laptop. Not stolen, she was careful about the distinction. Duplicated. For her own records. Because she was a lawyer and because she was frightened, which she would not have admitted to anyone but could acknowledge to herself at night with the door locked. She read Emma's text. Thursday, 11, Atlantic Avenue. She put the phone face down on the table and sat with the invitation for a while. She was not naive about what was happening. She had watched David operate for 3 years, been his confidant for 18 months, believed with the particular confidence of a person who is very good at their work that she was managing her own situation rather than being managed by someone else's. She had been wrong. She understood that now, with the same clarity that Sterling had found at 2 a.m. in his kitchen, the question was what to do about it. She could decline the meeting. She could keep her head down, let the audit run, hope that her own equity position was protected in whatever restructuring followed, and wait to see whether David's downfall engulfed her or merely singed her at the edges. That was the conservative option, the option a cautious person would take. Victoria was not cautious. Caution was not what had made her a partner at 31. She picked up the phone, typed, "I'll be there." Then she put the phone in her bag, closed the laptop, and went to the window, because she needed to look at something that was not the inside of her apartment. Below her, the city did what the city always did, which was continue indifferently, and she stood there for a long time thinking about Emma Kensington in that cream and navy dress signing divorce papers with that silver pen, and what it meant that the woman had texted her personally directly 2 days after the mediation. It meant she had known or suspected that Victoria was not simply collateral, that she had something Emma wanted. Not feared. Wanted. Victoria had spent 3 years being David Harper's most valuable professional ally. She knew things about that firm, its clients, its vulnerabilities, its private decisions that existed in no document. She knew them because David had trusted her, which was the best possible evidence that Emma had been right to consider her separately from him. She turned away from the window and began preparing for Thursday. Wednesday arrived with the news delivered through firm-wide email with the precise clinical brevity of bad news that has been wordsmithed by 4 people that Harrison Sterling's largest institutional client, a financial services group responsible for 22% of the firm's annual billings, had engaged a competing firm for its primary legal relationship. The email described this as a strategic realignment consistent with the client's evolving needs. Every person in the firm read it correctly. The stock, metaphorically speaking, had begun to fall. By Wednesday afternoon, the junior associate defections had started. 3 resigned before 5 o'clock. A 4th sent a resignation by email at 11 that night, which was either a statement or poor time management, and no one in the firm was in the mood to determine which. Sterling's assistant fielded 11 calls from partners requesting urgent meetings. Sterling took 4 of them, the 4 from partners whose departure would hurt the most, and he told each of them the same thing with variations. We are in a restructuring conversation. Nothing is determined. Your partnership agreement is intact. Give me the end of the week. He did not tell them about the Thursday meeting that Thomas Adler had confirmed at 2 that afternoon. Emma would speak with him. His office, Thursday at 2. He told no one, not because he was hiding it, but because he had learned in 30 years of managing crises that the moment you announce a lifeline, half the room stops swimming toward shore and starts waiting to be rescued, and the ones who stop swimming are not always the ones who deserve to drown. David Harper spent Wednesday in a fog that looked from the outside like professional functionality. He attended 2 client calls, reviewed 3 briefs, responded to 40 emails. From the outside, he was David Harper, senior partner, doing his job. From the inside, he was a man watching an avalanche that he had unknowingly started by tapping a single stone, trying to calculate whether any position he moved to would be outside its path. Victoria still hadn't called. She had texted Tuesday morning, "I need some time to think, not personal," and he had read it 8 times, trying to extract a meaning beyond its surface, and finding none or finding too many, which amounted to the same problem. His assistant knocked at 4:30. "Gregory Vance on line 2, she said. David picked up. "Gregory." "The motion to reopen settlement discovery," Gregory said without preamble, "has been denied." David absorbed this. "On what grounds?" The mediator ruled that the execution was clean. Both parties were represented by counsel, and there is no evidence of concealment of marital assets, which is technically correct. The Kensington holdings were never marital assets. They were Emma's family's corporate structure, which she had no legal obligation to disclose in the settlement. A pause. "I pushed every angle available to me, David. There is no angle." "So the settlement stands." "The settlement stands. The $300,000 goes to Emma within 30 days. The asset distributions are locked." Another pause, this one with a different texture. "I'm also withdrawing from any further engagement related to this matter. I'll send the formal notice to you and Claire Sutton's office today." David was quiet for a moment. "You're dropping me." "I'm concluding our engagement," Gregory said carefully. "What's happening at the firm now is not a divorce matter. It's a corporate restructuring matter, and it requires counsel with a different specialty than mine." He paused one final time. "For what it's worth, David, I've thought about this. About how she did it. The timing of the signing, the preparation, the patience." He seemed to hesitate over the next sentence, as though weighing whether to say it. He said it anyway. "In 23 years, I have never seen anyone execute a simultaneous personal and corporate strategy with that kind of precision. Whatever else happens, you were married to someone remarkable." David said nothing for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally in a voice that was quieter and more honest than any voice he had used in the conference room 3 days ago. "I know." The call ended. David sat at his desk, hands flat on the surface, and breathed. Thursday morning, Emma arrived at the botanical shop 2 hours before Victoria was due. She had work to do, a standing order of ficus lyrata for a restaurant in Carroll Gardens, a consulting call with a landscape architect in Portland, and she did it with the focused attention she brought to all of it, the same quality of presence she brought to corporate board meetings and family financial reviews and mediation sessions. Emma did not have a professional self and a personal self. She had one self calibrated to the situation, which was a different thing entirely. At 10:45, she set the kettle on, arranged 2 chairs near the back workbench, where the afternoon light came through the east window, and waited. Victoria arrived at 11:03, which was a slight lateness that Emma registered as intentional. A small assertion of autonomy from a woman who was being careful not to arrive looking desperate. She was in dark pants and a simple coat, no blazer, which read as deliberate casualness. She was carrying a leather folder that she held close to her side. "Thank you for coming," Emma said. "Thank you for the invitation," Victoria said. And there was a moment between them, a brief, honest mutual recognition that was entirely different from the cream blazer, corner-of-the-room silence of Tuesday's mediation. They were two intelligent women in a room together, which was a different kind of room entirely from the ones David Harper had occupied. Emma poured tea, set a cup in front of Victoria, sat down. "You said you had information I might need," Emma said. Victoria held her gaze. "I said I had information you might need and information I need help with. I was being honest about both." "Good," Emma said. "I appreciate honesty more than most things. Tell me what you know." Victoria opened the leather folder. She did not hand it to Emma immediately. She placed it on the workbench between them open and said, "Over 18 months, David disclosed to me voluntarily, without my asking, the following things about the firm's financial position." She paused. "I documented everything 2 nights ago because I needed a record that predated any restructuring conversation. But I'm showing it to you because what he told me affects more than just Harrison Sterling. It affects 3 clients whose data security may have been compromised by the way he managed their matters while prioritizing his own advancement." Emma looked at the document. Read the first page without touching it. Her expression did not change, but her eyes did something that Victoria, who was watching carefully, recognized immediately. Not surprise, not satisfaction. The specific settled recognition of a person who has suspected something and is now looking at confirmation. "He told you about the Meridian client situation," Emma said quietly. Victoria nodded. "And the Kowalski matter. And the Hennessy account." Emma looked up from the document. "Those clients need to know," she said. "Yes," Victoria said, "they do. And you're willing to be part of that disclosure." "I'm willing to be the person who makes it," Victoria said, "in the right context with the right protections in place." She paused. "Which is what I need help with." Emma sat back, looked at this woman who had been 3 days ago in the corner of a room laughing at her. Not with malice, with the particular thoughtlessness of someone who had not yet understood what they were looking at. And Emma looked at her now, really looked at her the way she looked at all things, and saw not an enemy and not an ally, but a person whose interests had shifted, and who was smart enough to know where they were now pointing. "I can connect you with the right counsel," Emma said, "independent of Kensington Global. Someone who handles regulatory disclosure matters and can protect your position while ensuring the clients are properly notified." "That's what I need," Victoria said. "I'll make the call this afternoon," Emma said. They sat for a moment with their tea. The shop was quiet around them, full of green things. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. Emma waited. "The whole time," Victoria said. 7 years. You knew what you had, what your family had, what it meant." She paused. "Why did you stay?" Emma looked at her for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was entirely without performance, which was the thing Victoria had not expected, and which afterward she would remember most clearly. "Because I believed he was better than he turned out to be," Emma said. "And I stayed past the point where the evidence supported that belief, which is not a strategic failure, it's a human one." She paused. "And then I stopped staying." Victoria looked at her hands, looked back up. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm sorry." Emma nodded once, not dismissing it, receiving it. "Make sure the right people hear what you know," Emma said. "That's worth more than sorry." At 2 o'clock that same afternoon, Emma walked into Harrison Sterling and Croft's Midtown offices for the first time in her life. Not as a partner's wife attending a holiday reception making small talk near a bar. As Emma Kensington, board member of Kensington Global, holding the debt and the lease and 3 days of audit documentation and the patience of a woman who had been planning this moment for 6 weeks and waiting for it her entire adult life. Richard Sterling met her in the lobby personally. He was 61, silver-haired, carrying himself with the upright precision of a man who intended to communicate stability, even when stability was exactly what was being assessed. He extended his hand. She shook it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking directly," she said. "I respect that." He walked her to the main conference room, not the secondary one where the audit team was working, but the one with the view and the long table and the chairs that cost more than most people's first cars. He had not populated it with associates or support staff. It was just him and his CFO. Emma sat down, placed her portfolio on the table, and looked at Richard Sterling with the same expression she had worn throughout the mediation, present, unreadable, complete. "You want to know what I want the firm to become," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "Then I'll tell you," Emma said. And she opened her portfolio and she began. She talked for 22 minutes without interruption. Sterling did not interrupt because within the first 4 minutes, he understood that interrupting would be both rude and pointless. She had thought all of this through far more completely than anything he would insert could address. His CFO, who had arrived expecting a negotiation, realized by minute 7 that he was not in a negotiation. He was in a presentation that had been prepared with the thoroughness of a full acquisition strategy because that was exactly what it was. By minute 22, the CFO had filled 4 pages of his notepad with figures. Sterling had written nothing. He was looking at Emma Kensington with the expression of a man who had built something for 30 years and was now being told quietly and precisely and without cruelty what it had actually been worth the whole time and what it could be worth going forward under new management, and finding that the second number was considerably larger than the first. "You'd keep the name," he said when she finished. It was not his most important question, but it was the first one he asked. "I'd keep what the name represents," Emma said carefully. "The reputation with clients, the relationships the partners have, built the institutional knowledge. What I would change is the structure underneath it." "And the partners," he said. "The partners who can demonstrate clean client relationships and appropriate conduct keep their equity. The ones who can't," she paused, "let the pause do the work." "Don't." Sterling looked at her steadily. "David," he said, "is not your problem to solve," Emma said. "He's already solved himself." The CFO made a small sound that he converted into a cough. Sterling sat back in his chair and looked at the woman across from him, this 32-year-old who had grown plants in Brooklyn and known the Latin names of things and held a board seat and a master lease and a $90 million debt position, and who had sat in a mediation room 3 days ago and signed her name in the silence while the wolves thought they were winning. "I'll need to consult the partners," he said. "Of course," Emma said. "You have until Monday's audit session concludes." She closed her portfolio, stood up. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not here to destroy what you built. I'm here because I can see what it could have been, and I think you can too." She extended her hand. He took it, held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. "I think," he said with the particular candor of a man who has spent 30 years being careful with words and is now briefly being careless with them in the best possible way, "that my firm underestimated you for a very long time, and I include myself in that." Emma looked at him with the expression she had worn throughout all of it in the mediation room in the botanical shop in the lobby of this building, the expression that was not cold and not triumphant, but something much harder to replicate, which was simply the expression of a person who had always known exactly who they were and had been patient enough to let everyone else figure it out. "Most people do," she said, "and then they don't." She walked out of the conference room, down the hallway, past the audit team's room where the light was still on, and Patricia Cho's team was still building the documented record of everything that needed to be seen. She passed the floor where David's office was without looking at it. She took the elevator to the lobby and walked through the glass doors onto the Midtown street. Her phone buzzed, a text from her father. "How did it feel?" he asked. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the Thursday afternoon crowd, surrounded by people who had no idea what had just happened 17 floors above them. And she thought about Richard Sterling's handshake and the CFO's 4 pages of notes, and the particular texture of a room full of people who have finally stopped underestimating you. "Like arriving somewhere I was always going," she typed back. His response came in 6 seconds. "Then rest. The hard part is over. The good part begins." She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the subway toward Brooklyn, toward the shop where the plants were waiting, and the next thing was already taking root. Richard Sterling called the full partners meeting for Friday at 8 in the morning, which told everyone who received the calendar invite everything they needed to know about the severity of what was coming. Partners meetings at Harrison Sterling did not happen at 8 in the morning. They happened at 10, sometimes 11, with coffee service and a prepared agenda distributed 24 hours in advance. An 8 o'clock Friday summons with no pre-circulated agenda was the firm equivalent of a fire alarm, except the building was not on fire. The building had already been burning for 3 days, and most of them were only now being told to look up. 17 of the 32 partners attended in person. The remaining 15 joined by video, some of them visibly in home offices, one apparently calling from what looked like an airport gate. Sterling looked at the assembled faces, people he had worked beside for decades, people whose children he knew, people whose careers he had shaped and who had shaped his, and he felt the particular weight of a man who has been given a choice by someone else and must now present that choice as though it is his own. He told them everything, not in the careful, managed language he might have used a week ago, but directly because they deserved directness, and because there was no version of this that careful language improved. He told them about the debt acquisition, the lease, the audit, the meeting with Emma Kensington the previous afternoon. He told them what she had proposed and what the alternative was, and he told them both options without editorial commentary, which was the most honest thing he could do and the hardest. The room was very quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then Marcus Webb, who was sitting 3 chairs down from Sterling, and whose face had been doing complicated things throughout the presentation, said, "She's 32 years old." "She is," Sterling said, "and she's been on the Kensington board since 28. "Correct." "And David—" Marcus paused, looked at the empty chair where David Harper would have been sitting. David didn't know. "David says he didn't know," Sterling said carefully. "I have no evidence to contradict that." Another silence, longer this time. A partner named Judith Harlow, who was 58 and had been at the firm for 19 years and was one of the 4 Sterling had called individually to keep from leaving, spoke from the far end of the table. "What happens to our equity if we accept her proposal?" Sterling looked at her directly. "Protected for those of us with clean client records." She was explicit about that. "And David," Sterling paused one beat, "is not part of the proposal." The room understood what that meant. A few people exchanged glances. Nobody asked the follow-up question aloud, which was the most eloquent possible answer to it. "I need a vote," Sterling said. "Not advisory, binding. We accept her terms and begin restructuring under Kensington Global's acquisition framework, or we decline and manage the consequences of the debt call and lease termination independently." He looked around the room. "I'll tell you what I told Harrison last night. I think we survive if we restructure. I don't think we survive if we don't." He paused. "But this is your firm as much as mine. I'm not making this decision alone." The vote took 11 minutes, including 5 minutes of the most compressed, intense crosstalk Sterling had ever witnessed in a partners' meeting. When the count came in, it was 26-6 in favor of accepting Emma's proposal. Sterling nodded, picked up his phone, called Thomas Adler. "Tell her we accept," he said, "and tell her I'd like to schedule a transition meeting as soon as she's available." "I'll let her know," Adler said. Sterling hung up, looked at the room full of people whose professional futures had just pivoted on the decision of a 32-year-old woman they had collectively spent years being unaware of, and said simply, "We have work to do." David Harper was not in that meeting. He had not been invited, and the absence of an invitation was itself the message. He had received Sterling's calendar notification, like everyone else seen his own name conspicuously absent from the recipient list, and understood. He was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office when the vote happened, though he did not know about the vote until Marcus Webb texted him at 9:47. "It passed, 26-6. You should talk to a lawyer, David, not Gregory, someone new." He read the text twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and looked at his coffee for a long time. The person he wanted to call was Victoria. He understood that with the clarity of someone who has relied on a single professional relationship for emotional equilibrium for 18 months and is now faced with its sudden absence like a missing step. He had called her 6 times since Tuesday. She had answered once briefly to tell him she needed space to manage her own situation and that she would reach out when she could. The call had lasted 4 minutes. She had not called back. He wanted to be angry about that. He tried anger and found it didn't hold, because Victoria was doing exactly what he would have done in her position, which was identify the lifeboat and get in it, and not look back, and he could not in honesty blame her for a quality that he himself possessed in equal measure. He called a lawyer instead. Not Gregory. Someone from outside his circle. Someone whose name he had encountered in a context completely separate from his own professional world. someone who had no prior knowledge of any of this and therefore no prior positioning. He reached the attorney's assistant, left his name and a brief description of the matter, and was told he would receive a call back that afternoon. Then he sat in the coffee shop and tried to build an honest inventory of where he was. Partnership equity effectively voided by the restructuring pending whatever claim he could make under his original partnership agreement, which was now being reviewed by a firm he no longer effectively worked at, under terms that had shifted in ways no one had anticipated when the agreement was written. Apartment technically his through the settlement, but leased, and the lease came up in 4 months. And his income situation was now genuinely uncertain for the first time since he was 26 years old. The Montauk property, held in the trust that Gregory had failed to adequately protect in the settlement review, which meant Emma's team could revisit the valuation question despite the signed settlement. Gregory had been wrong about that door being fully closed. David's new attorney would need to assess it. He was 41 years old. He had built an identity so thoroughly around being a senior partner at a prestigious firm that he was not entirely certain, sitting in this coffee shop, what remained of him when you removed that identity. He was charming. He was intelligent. He was good at the work itself, divorced from the status of the work. He had skills that were transferable. He had relationships, some of which had survived this week, and some of which had not. He had a settlement check for $300,000 coming within 30 days, which was the same number he had offered Emma, and which now sat in his awareness with an irony so complete it had moved past painful into something almost structural, like a load-bearing beam you couldn't remove. He picked up the coffee, drank it, made himself do the honest thing, the thing he had been circling for 4 days without quite landing on it. He thought about Emma. Not strategically. Not in terms of what claims she might still pursue or what position Kensington Global's acquisition left him in. He thought about her the way you think about a person when all the professional and financial scaffolding falls away and you're sitting alone in a coffee shop at 9:50 in the morning with nowhere to be. He thought about the botanical shop, which he had called her little hobby for years, with the comfortable condescension of a man who believed that what happened inside a marriage was automatically less significant than what happened outside of it. He thought about Sunday mornings, when she would come home from the shop with soil under her nails and a particular quiet energy that he had never asked about, never been curious about, because he had already decided what it meant and what it was worth. He thought about the dinners where he had talked about his cases and his clients and his partners, and she had listened and asked the occasional quiet question, and he had taken her listening as confirmation of her lesser position in the conversation rather than what it apparently was, which was research. He thought about the 12 times in their marriage he could identify sitting here now when she had tried to tell him something about herself, her real self, the Kensington Global board member self, the daughter of Arthur self, and he had redirected the conversation to something about himself within 2 exchanges. He thought about those 12 times with the 6 specific clarity of retrospective understanding, which is the most useless kind of understanding there is, and the most honest. He had not been a good husband. He had been a performative one, which is a different category entirely. He paid for his coffee and walked out into the gray morning and took the long way back to the apartment that was temporarily still his, and he let himself feel the full weight of that understanding without trying to argue himself out of it, because the only thing left that he could control was whether he was honest with himself about what had happened and why. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was a real one, and for the first time in a week, something about that felt marginally better than the alternative. Victoria Chase's meeting with the independent counsel Emma had arranged happened Friday afternoon in a small conference room at a law firm in the Flatiron District that specialized in regulatory disclosure matters. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who had 20 years of SEC and regulatory experience, listened to Victoria for 40 minutes without taking a single note, which Victoria found both unnerving and oddly reassuring. When Victoria finished, Sandra Park asked 3 questions. The first was about the timeline of David's disclosures. The second was about Victoria's own direct involvement with the affected client accounts. The third was about what Victoria wanted as an outcome. Victoria answered the first 2 precisely. She paused on the third. "I want to be protected," she said. "I want the clients to be properly notified. And I want the record to reflect that when I understood what I had, I came forward voluntarily." Sandra Park looked at her steadily. "Those 3 things are compatible," she said. "Let me show you how." By the end of that Friday, Victoria Chase had signed a formal disclosure agreement and handed Sandra Park's firm the complete documentation she had compiled over the preceding 3 nights. The agreement protected her equity position in the restructuring, required her cooperation with a regulatory review of the 3 client matters David had compromised, and established on the official record that her disclosure had been voluntary, proactive, and preceded any formal investigation. Emma, who had received a brief summary from Sandra Park's office by 5:30 that afternoon, read it at the workbench in her botanical shop and felt something she had not entirely expected, which was not satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. A kind of sorrow that was not for herself, for the client families whose matters had been mishandled, for the associates and junior staff at the firm who had built careers under people who were building something rotten underneath them, for the waste of it all. The unnecessary waste, which was what arrogance always ultimately produced, not just downfall for the person at the center, but collateral damage to everyone who had trusted the structure. She called Arthur, not for a business reason, because she needed to hear his voice. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, because he always knew the tone. "I'm fine," she said. It's a lot of damage, Papa. When you finally see all of it, the clients, the staff, Yes," he said quietly. "I knew there would be damage. I planned for it. But knowing something and standing in it are different." "They always are," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Emma, what you did the way you did it, you protected the innocent. The junior staff keep their jobs in the restructuring. The clients are being made whole through the disclosure. The partners with clean records keep their equity. You were surgical." "I know," she said. "But it still feels like something was lost." "Yes," she said. "That feeling," Arthur said very gently, "is the thing that makes you someone I trust with what I've built. The people who enjoy this part, the ones who don't feel what you're feeling right now, they're the ones I worry about." A pause. "Rest this weekend, sweetheart. What comes next is the good part." She smiled alone in the shop, surrounded by plants. "You said that last time." "I know," he said. "I meant it both times." She hung up and sat for a while in the quiet, and then she began writing the job listings for the sanctuary project, which she had been drafting in fragments for 2 weeks, and which she now had the space finally to finish. The following Monday, David received a certified letter from Kensington Global's legal team, not threatening, not aggressive, precise. It outlined the terms of the firm's restructuring, and David's position within it, which was his partnership agreement, was terminated under the clause relating to conduct detrimental to the firm effective immediately. His equity stake, which under normal circumstances would have vested fully in 2 years, was calculated at its current prorated value. A check was enclosed. He looked at the amount, set the letter down, picked it up again. $300,000. Not a penny more, not a penny less. He stood in his kitchen holding the check for a long time. He understood what it meant, not the amount itself, but the precision of it. She had calculated exactly what she had received in the settlement. She had sent back the exact equivalent, not out of spite. There was no message here that was cruel, no note attached with a pointed comment, just the amount, just the number. It was the most complete statement he had ever received in his life, and it had not required a single word. His new attorney called at noon. "The Montauk Trust valuation challenge is viable," she said, "but it would require 18 months of litigation, significant legal fees, and a public record of the proceedings that would affect your professional reputation during a period when you'll be seeking new employment." A pause. "My recommendation is to let it go." David was quiet for a moment. "What are my actual options at this point? You have the $300,000 from the settlement, the $300,000 from the equity payout, the personal property from the apartment, and your legal skills, which are considerable," she said. "You also have a professional reputation that is currently complicated but not destroyed. The conduct that affected the firm's clients was David's disclosure of information to Victoria. The legal determination is that this was a judgment failure, not a deliberate ethics breach. That's an important distinction." Another pause. "You can rebuild. It will take time. It will require humility. But you can rebuild." "Humility," David said with a tone that was not quite sarcasm and not quite self-awareness, and landed somewhere between them. "That's my clinical assessment," she said pleasantly. After the call, David walked through the penthouse apartment one final time. He had arranged to vacate by the end of the month, which was 3 weeks away. He had put almost nothing up for sale, had realized going through the rooms that the majority of what filled them were things he had accumulated as evidence of success rather than things he had chosen because he loved them. The art on the walls, the furniture that had been selected by a designer he had met twice, the kitchen appliances he had used approximately 4 times. He stopped in the hallway at the single framed photograph that had somehow survived 6 years in an apartment full of expensive things without ever being moved or repositioned. It was a picture taken at a botanical conference Emma had attended 3 years into their marriage in a conservatory somewhere upstate, and she was standing among enormous tropical plants looking at something off-camera with an expression of complete, uncomplicated happiness. He had barely noticed the photograph when they hung it. He had walked past it perhaps 1,000 times without looking. He looked at it now. He took it carefully off the wall, stood holding it. And then with a care he had not applied to anything in the apartment in years, he wrapped it in a piece of cloth from the kitchen, put it in a bag, and set it by the door to take with him. He was not sure why. He was not sure he needed to be sure why. Victoria Chase left Harrison Sterling 4 days after the disclosure agreement was signed. She had negotiated her departure terms directly with the restructuring team, which reported to Kensington Global, which meant she was in the final analysis negotiating her exit with Emma Kensington's organization. She found this fact both humbling and clarifying in equal proportion. The terms were fair, more than fair. Her equity was protected. Her professional record noted the voluntary disclosure, and she was given a departure reference that described her as a skilled attorney whose judgment had been affected by a personal relationship and who had demonstrated integrity when it mattered. She cleared her office on a Wednesday evening alone after most of the floor had emptied. She had 3 boxes. One was files and professional materials. One was personal items. One was books she had accumulated over 8 years at the firm, which was always the heaviest box in any office departure, and always the most honest inventory of who you had been while you were there. As she was carrying the last box to the elevator, she passed Marcus Webb coming the other direction. They looked at each other. "You did the right thing," Marcus said. Victoria shifted the box. "Late," she said. "Better than not at all," he said. She nodded, got in the elevator, pressed the lobby button. As the doors closed, she looked at the floor numbers descending and thought about what Sandra Park had said in their first meeting when Victoria had asked somewhat rawly whether she was going to be okay. Sandra had looked at her with the direct, measured honesty of someone who has seen all categories of professional crisis and knows the difference between the survivable and the unsurvivable. "You have skills," Sandra had said. "You have self-awareness, apparently, which arrived later than ideal, but is present and functioning. And you just made a decision that a lot of people in your position would not have made." She paused. "Yes, you're going to be okay." The elevator reached the lobby. Victoria Chase walked through the glass doors into the city, into the cold November air, with 3 boxes and a professional reference, and a future that she had not yet determined the shape of, but that was at minimum clean, which was more than she had walked in with when she thought about it honestly. And David Harper, standing in his borrowed Brooklyn storage unit 2 miles away, placing the photograph of Emma in a box of things he was keeping, was thinking about the same quality cleanness, the plain, unglamorous, non-negotiable value of it, and understanding at 41 the same thing that Victoria was understanding at 31, which was that there are certain lessons that cannot be taught and can only be lived through at full cost, and that the cost, while real and permanent, was not the end of the story. It was only the end of that particular version of it, the hard version, the version where the ground was made of things that weren't solid, where the identities were costumes and the partnerships were performances, and the power was borrowed from structures that could be renegotiated by a woman with a silver pen and 14 months of patience. That version was over. What came after it was different, smaller in some ways, less decorated, more real. Emma Kensington signed the final acquisition documents on a Friday afternoon in late November in a conference room that had been Harrison Sterling and Croft's executive suite and was now officially, and in all the ways that mattered, hers. Not hers personally, Kensington Global's, which was the same thing and also, more importantly, bigger than any single person. Thomas Adler placed the final page in front of her. She picked up her pen, the silver one because she was Emma Kensington, and she had that kind of precision about symbols. She signed. Richard Sterling, sitting across the table, watched her do it with an expression that contained 30 years of professional pride and the particular grace of a man who has learned late but completely the difference between the person holding the deed and the person who built the house, and how sometimes those were the same person and sometimes they weren't, and how the important thing was knowing which was which. "Welcome to the firm," he said. "Thank you," Emma said. She capped her pen, looked at the document, looked at him. "We have a lot of work to do." "We do?" he said. She nodded, stood, and as she gathered the documents that were now hers, truly legally, irrevocably hers, not as a wife or a daughter but as herself, she felt the particular, irreplaceable feeling of a thing completed, not triumphant, not vindicated, something quieter and more durable than either of those. The feeling of a person who has been patient for the right amount of time, in the right direction, for the right reasons. The feeling of arrival. And in a Brooklyn botanical shop, the plants grew on in the particular unself-conscious way of things that do not need to announce themselves to be exactly what they are. The offices of Harrison Sterling did not change overnight. Nothing real ever does. What changed first was the smallest things, which is always how genuine transformation announces itself, not with press releases or grand gestures, but with the incremental evidence that the person now holding the pen is different from the person who held it before. New procurement policies that prioritized vendors with ethical labor certifications. A revised associate review process that removed the informal sponsorship system through which certain partners had historically advanced certain associates for reasons unrelated to merit. A transparent billing audit that identified 6 active client accounts with fee structures that needed correction and corrected them and informed the clients of the correction with a letter that Sterling signed and Emma approved, and that not a single client had ever received from a law firm in their professional lives. The clients called, not to complain, to express something considerably more valuable, which was surprise, and then after the surprise trust. Emma sat in the office that had once been the executive conference room and was now her working space when she was in the Midtown building. She kept the Brooklyn shop always as the place she thought, in the place she returned to when the corporate world required her to remember what things actually were. And she managed the transition with the same quality she had brought to all of it, which was patience operating at speed. Moving fast on the things that needed to move fast, holding still on the things that required stillness. Understanding the difference, which was the skill beneath all the other skills. Richard Sterling adapted with more grace than Emma had expected, and less than he would have predicted of himself, which was the honest truth of most significant adjustments. There were moments when he walked into a room and began to operate by 30 years of reflex, his room, his table, his firm, and had to consciously recalibrate. Emma noticed these moments and said nothing about them because she was not interested in his ego and was not interested in bruising it either. She was interested in what he knew and what he could do, and whether those things served the firm's new direction. They did mostly. The exception was a conversation in early December, 6 weeks into the transition, when Sterling recommended against accepting a new client on the grounds that the client's industry profile was politically complicated and might generate unwanted attention. Emma had listened to his reasoning. Then she said simply, "Our job is to provide excellent legal representation, not to manage our reputation by avoiding complicated clients." Sterling had paused. "That's a significant departure from our traditional risk framework." "Yes," Emma said, "it is." She looked at him. "That's not a criticism of what you built. It's a description of what we're building. Are you comfortable with the difference?" He thought about it honestly, which she had come to recognize as one of his better qualities. Then he said, "I'm getting there." "Good," she said. "That's all I'm asking." The Sanctuary Project launched on the first Monday of the new year, which felt right to Emma in a way that was more personal than strategic. New year, new institution, new mission. The offices occupied 3 floors of the Midtown building that had been reconfigured during the restructuring, and they were staffed by 8 attorneys, 2 paralegals, 2 social workers, and an administrative team that Emma had recruited over the preceding 6 weeks, with the same rigor she applied to everything. The mission was specific and unapologetic pro bono legal representation for spouses in high-net-worth divorces who had been financially isolated, professionally suppressed, or otherwise left without recourse by partners who had used money and access as instruments of control. Emma had written the mission statement herself, 3 drafts, each one sharper than the last, until the final version said exactly what needed to be said without a single unnecessary word. Claire Sutton became the Sanctuary Project's first director, which surprised some people and surprised no one who had paid attention to how Claire had managed the Harper divorce proceedings. She accepted the position with the particular contained energy of a person being handed work they were built for. On the morning of the launch, she pulled Emma aside in the hallway and said, "There are 47 intake requests already in the queue, as of this morning." Emma absorbed that number. "How many do we have capacity for in the first month?" 12 if we're thorough, which we will be. "Then we'll be adding capacity in month 2, Emma said. Claire nodded, turned to go, turned back. "Emma." She paused, choosing words with the care of a lawyer who knows the weight they carry. "What you built here, this wasn't collateral to the other thing. This was the point of the other thing, wasn't it?" Emma looked at her. "It always was," she said. The news of the Sanctuary Project's launch generated coverage that Emma had not solicited and did not encourage, but that arrived anyway because the story was objectively extraordinary. A 32-year-old woman who had signed a divorce settlement under what appeared to be financial duress had within 60 days completed a hostile corporate acquisition of her ex-husband's firm and converted a portion of its offices into a legal aid center for financially vulnerable spouses. The narrative wrote itself, which was both useful and slightly uncomfortable, because Emma had not done any of this for the narrative. She had done it because it needed doing, and those were categories that the press struggled to hold simultaneously. She declined most interview requests. She gave one to a journalist at a publication she respected because the journalist asked questions about the Sanctuary Project's operational model rather than about David, and Emma answered those questions thoroughly and let the record stand. The article ran with a photograph of Emma in the botanical shop standing among her plants, which was the image she had offered, rather than the image of her in the Midtown offices, and which communicated for anyone reading carefully something true about the relationship between the two places in her life. Arthur Kensington read the article in Geneva and called her at 7 in the morning New York time, which was 1 in the afternoon for him, and said, "They got you right," which from Arthur was a review so complete it required no elaboration. "The journalist was good," Emma said. "The subject was good," Arthur said. "The journalist just didn't ruin it." She was in the shop when they spoke, repotting a large bird of paradise that had outgrown its container, her hands in soil, her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, talking to her father the way she had always talked to him across distances, across time zones, with the particular ease of a relationship built on genuine mutual respect between two people who happened to also be family. "I'm coming to New York in March," he said. "Board meeting, and I want to see the Sanctuary Project." "I'll clear the calendar," she said. "Don't clear anything. I want to see it operating, not performing for me." A pause. "How are you, Emma? Not the project, you." She thought about the question, pressed her hands into the soil. "I'm good," she said. "I'm actually genuinely good, Papa. Not fine. Good." "You sound like it," he said, and she could hear in his voice the particular warmth of a father who has worried about something for a long time and has just set the worry down. That's all I needed to know. David Harper found out about the Sanctuary Project the same way most people did, which was through a news alert on his phone. He was in Philadelphia by then, working at a mid-sized firm that had taken him on as a senior associate, not a partner, an associate which was a humbling categorical step that his new therapist, whom he had begun seeing in December, had encouraged him to regard as appropriate rather than punitive. He read the article about the Sanctuary Project on a Tuesday morning before his first client call and sat with it for a while before he could fully process what he was reading. Not the acquisition he had known about that had followed the transition from a professional and personal distance that felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable, but the project itself, the mission, the 47 intake requests on the first day. He read the mission statement twice. He thought about the conversation he'd had with his therapist 2 weeks earlier, in which he'd described Emma as someone who had been patient and strategic, and in the final analysis had beaten him at a game he hadn't known they were playing. His therapist had let him sit with that framing for a moment, and then said carefully, "Is it possible that she wasn't playing a game?" David had said somewhat defensively. "Then what was she doing?" "Building something," his therapist said. That required removing a specific obstacle first. He had not responded well to that framing in the session. He was responding better to it now, reading the Sanctuary Project mission statement on his phone at 7:40 in the morning in a city that was not Manhattan, and an office that was not a partnership with a cup of coffee he had made himself rather than had brought to him. He was not a villain in his own interior life because no one ever is, but he was slowly and effortfully and with the resistance that genuine self-examination always produces in people who have spent decades building identity rather than character, arriving at an honest assessment of what had happened and his role in it. He had used advantage like a language so long he had stopped noticing he was speaking it. He had translated Emma's silence as absence rather than intelligence. He had looked at a woman who held a board seat and a moral framework and a plan she had been building since before they met, and he had seen a hobby and a flower shop and a personality trait called quiet. He put the phone face down, picked it up again, typed a message to the one person he felt he could send it to without it being misinterpreted or leveraged or used as evidence of anything other than what it was. He typed, "Saw the news about the Sanctuary Project. It's remarkable. You were always building towards something. I just never asked what." He addressed it to Emma. He did not expect a response. He pressed send because it was true, and because one of the things his therapist had told him, which he had written down and read several times since, was that accountability offered without expectation of return is one of the few things that begins to restore a person to themselves. He sent it and put the phone away and went to his first client call. Emma saw the message at noon between the Sanctuary Project's weekly staff meeting and a call with Claire about month 2 staffing. She read it once, sat with it. She typed back, "Thank you, David." Then after a brief pause, she added, "I hope Philadelphia is treating you well." She sent it, put the phone in her desk drawer, closed the drawer, and returned to the meeting because the work was here, and it was real, and it was the thing that mattered. Victoria Chase resurfaced in February with a position at a regulatory consulting firm that worked with financial institutions on compliance frameworks, which was, as she told Marcus Webb in the brief text exchange, through which they maintained the vestigial professional friendship that had survived everything else, exactly the right use of what she had learned and exactly the distance she needed from what she had done. Marcus replied, "Good. You're too good at this to disappear." Victoria replied, "I know." Then, after a moment, "Tell Sterling I said good luck with Emma." Marcus replied, "She doesn't need luck. Neither honestly does he. They're both terrifyingly competent." Victoria put the phone down and returned to a compliance brief she was writing, and found to her genuine surprise that she was enjoying it. Not performing enjoyment, actually experiencing the particular satisfaction of work that was clean. Work you didn't have to manage the edges of. Work that didn't require you to keep track of what you'd said to whom and whether it was consistent. She had not known before all of this how much cognitive load she had been carrying in the maintenance of a professional identity built partly on proximity to someone else's power. She understood now why Emma, who had always had her own power and had simply chosen not to display it, had seemed so relaxed in the mediation room. When you're not performing anything, the baseline level of effort drops considerably. It was a lesson that had cost her 18 months and 1 partnership. She intended to make use of it for considerably longer than that. The thing about Emma Kensington that the article got right, and that everyone who had observed her from the outside struggled to fully articulate, was that she was not defined by what she had defeated. This was unusual enough to be notable. Most narratives of this kind, the wronged party who builds back and overcomes, organize themselves around the overcoming. The villain falls, the protagonist rises the falling, and the rising are understood as the story's essential relationship. But Emma's story didn't work that way. The acquisition was not the point. The divorce was not the point. David's professional unraveling was a consequence of his own choices facilitated by her precision, but it was not something she had built toward. What she had built toward was always the Sanctuary Project, always the next thing that the cleared space would make possible. The removal of David and the dissolution of the marriage and the restructuring of the firm were necessary scaffolding precisely constructed, but scaffolding nonetheless. What she was building behind it was the thing that mattered. This was a distinction that most people encountered only in retrospect, if at all. Emma had held it from the beginning. On a Thursday afternoon in late March, Arthur Kensington arrived at the Sanctuary Project offices in Midtown as he had promised, without announcement at 2 in the afternoon, wearing a coat that had been made for him in London 30 years ago, and that he wore with the comfortable authority of a man who has long since stopped needing to communicate anything to anyone about who he is. Emma met him in the lobby. They hugged in the way of people who have not seen each other in 4 months, but speak 3 times a week, which is to say warmly and briefly and without performance. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through the intake process which Claire walked him through personally because she was better at explaining it than Emma was. She walked him through the current active cases, not the details, those were confidential, but the categories, the patterns, the particular and recurring story of how financial abuse operated in high net worth divorces, how it hid in plain sight behind complexity and leverage and the institutional assumption that the person with the better attorney was the person with the better case. Arthur listened to all of it the way he listened to board presentations completely, without fidgeting, without preemptive opinion, and when Claire finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many cases have you closed?" he asked. 9 completed resolutions in the first 3 months, Claire said. Total recovered assets for clients, $4,300,000. Average case resolution time, 6 weeks. Arthur looked at Emma. 6 weeks, he said. "We're not interested in long litigation," Emma said. "We're interested in resolution, fast, complete, and documented." Arthur nodded slowly. Then he said to Claire, "What do you need that you don't have?" Claire blinked, glanced at Emma, who gave a small nod. "A second social worker," Claire said. "A tech platform for intake management. And eventually, not yet, but within 18 months, a second location. There's a need in Chicago that we're already getting requests from." Arthur pulled out his phone, made a note, put the phone away. "You'll have the social worker and the tech platform by end of quarter," he said. "Chicago we discuss in the fall." Claire looked at him with an expression that was professional composure, barely containing something considerably more alive. "Thank you," she said. "Thank Emma," Arthur said simply. "She built the argument before she built the institution. That's the correct order of operations." After Claire left them, Emma and Arthur sat together in Emma's office, the one with the monstera cutting she had brought from Brooklyn to root on the windowsill, because she was Emma Kensington, and she brought plants to every room she intended to stay in, and they drank coffee and were quiet for a while, the way people are quiet when there is nothing urgent remaining to be said. "Are you happy?" Arthur asked. Emma considered the word. It was a word she thought about carefully, the way she thought about all precise things. Happiness was not a constant state. It was a quality that appeared in moments of alignment between who you were and what you were doing, between what you valued and how you spent your time, between the person you had been in the hardest moments and the person you recognized when you looked inward. "Yes," she said. "Not easily, not all the time, but yes." "That's the right kind," Arthur said. She looked at him. "You worried about me?" "From the moment you told me about the marriage," he said with the directness of a man who does not soften things he has already said in his own interior and sees no reason to soften them aloud. "Not about your ability to manage it, about what it was costing you to manage it." Emma was quiet. "You were carrying someone else's smallness for 7 years," Arthur said. "I watched you do it. I didn't say enough because I believed you needed to arrive at the decision yourself, which you did." He paused. "But I should have said earlier that you were allowed to put it down." Emma looked at her father for a long moment, at the coat that was 30 years old, and the hands that had built something from nothing, and the eyes that had always seen her completely. "I knew I was allowed," she said quietly. "I just needed to know where I was putting it down to." He looked at her steadily. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has just heard the precise sentence that answers a question he has been carrying for longer than either of them acknowledged. "And now you know," he said. "And now I know," she said. 6 months after the Sanctuary Project opened, Emma stood in the Brooklyn Botanical Shop on a Saturday morning, attending to the plants the way she always attended to them, with her hands with soil, with the particular quality of care that is not performed for anyone that exists, purely because the thing in front of you is alive and needs tending, and that is reason enough. The shop was open. Customers came in and went out. She spoke to some of them, not to others, reading the room the way she had always read rooms. A woman buying a gift, a college student looking for something hearty, a man who stood in front of a ficus for 4 minutes and then asked Emma, slightly self-consciously, whether it was hard to keep alive. "Not if you pay attention to it," Emma said. "Most plants fail because people stop looking at them." He bought the ficus. Emma wrapped it carefully, gave him specific care instructions, and told him to call the shop if he had questions. After he left, she stood alone for a moment in the familiar quiet of the place she had built first, before the board seat and the acquisition and the sanctuary project and all the rest of it. The place she had come to when the marriage was still standing, and she was beginning to understand that standing was not the same as right. The place where she had first sat with cold coffee and a laptop and her father's voice in her ear, finding the fault line. She thought about what she had built and what she had cleared away to build it. She thought about David in Philadelphia and Victoria in her compliance firm, and Richard Sterling adjusting with grace to a firm he no longer owned but still usefully inhabited. She thought about the 47 intake requests on the sanctuary project's first morning, and the 9 completed cases, and the $4 million returned to the people it belonged to, and the Chicago location that was 18 months away and not a single day further. She thought about the silver pen which was in her desk drawer upstairs, capped and clean, which was how it had been when she carried it into the mediation room and how it remained. She did not regret any of it, not the 7 years which had taught her things about the nature of being underestimated that she could not have learned any other way. Not the silence which had been a choice and a strategy, and underneath both of those a form of self-preservation that she had not fully understood at the time, but understood completely now. Not the signing which had looked like surrender to everyone in that room and had been in the most precise sense possible the opposite. Emma Kensington had walked into a room where every person expected her to lose, and she had signed her name slowly and clearly and without a single tremor, and she had walked out into the world she was already building, and she had built it. Not because she needed to prove something to David or to Gregory Vance or to Victoria in her cream blazer or to any of the versions of the world that had looked at a quiet woman in a botanical shop and seen decoration, but because she was Emma Kensington, daughter of Arthur Keeper of Green Things, board member, strategist, founder, and the kind of person who understood from a very young age that the most powerful statement a human being can make is not a threat or a declaration or a carefully orchestrated public moment of triumph. It is simply this: to become completely and without apology the full size of who you actually are. She had done that. She was doing it still. She would keep doing it with the same patient, unhurried, absolute certainty with which her plants grew toward the light, because that was the nature of things that are genuinely alive, and Emma Kensington was in every sense that mattered fully and finally and irrevocably alive. The silver pen stayed in the drawer. The plants grew on. The sanctuary project opened its doors every morning at 9. And the city moved around all of it, indifferent and enormous as cities always do, unable to stop the quiet, steady, extraordinary work of a woman who had always known exactly what she was doing.